Welcome back. In this video, we're going to discuss interest groups influencing policy making. So let's get right to it. So what is an interest group? It's an organization that attempts to influence public policy. Some interest groups for a very specific purpose, others for a more broad, general goal in mind. So for example, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, they have one main policy, one main thing that they care about, which is gun rights. And so all their efforts are at the idea of promoting gun rights and preventing gun control legislation. Other interest groups, like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, on the other hand, they look at a broader array of issues, anything having to do with civil rights and civil liberties. So they might at one moment be looking at free speech cases, then in the other at due process and rights of the accused or death penalty cases. So interest groups, again, their goal is to influence policy, some for specific purposes, some for more broad purposes. Okay, so what do interest groups do? How do they actually influence policy? Because there are no NRA members of Congress or ACLU. They're not a political party, so they don't recruit candidates, they don't nominate candidates, they don't run candidates for office. But one thing they do is that they can mobilize and get out the vote, just like political parties, but this time it's to support candidates that support the initiatives of the interest group. So they can endorse candidates and say, all right, that candidate is an A-rated candidate from our interest group. If you believe in the issue that we do and you're on our side, then vote for that person because she does too. They can then make sure and help support people that are of that same opinion, that believe in whatever it is, whether it's gun rights or civil liberties or pro-choice or pro-life legislation, that they actually get out and vote. So that's the mobilizing and the GOTV get out the vote efforts that they can then take part in. So interest groups can educate both the public, voters, as well as policymakers. So they try to inform voters to come join their side, so they reach out to them, but they also try to reach out to those holding office or those working within the government. And again, they do this by providing them with specialized expert information that promotes their side, their agenda, their beliefs. And they do this by trying to influence them and to say, all right, this is why you need to pass such and such piece of legislation or repeal this regulation, could be an example of that. Likewise, they can give information to congressmen about their constituents and show that their constituents may support the same goal as the interest group. Again, ramping up that pressure to say, this is why you need to vote with us. Look, your constituents are on our side as well. Now, additionally, they may be involved in drafting legislation. Now, this might sound a little bit surprising because we know that members of Congress are the ones who make legislation, but people from interest groups are sometimes involved. They can be there, sitting there in meetings, talking about the wording of bills, helping to actually get that legislation crafted and written in a way that the interest group supports and approves of. So again, this can be a tremendous source of power for an interest group. Again, just keep in mind that only a member of the House or a senator can actually introduce the legislation, so an interest group still can't do that, but they can help to write that bill. So that takes us very nicely into lobbying, one of the main tasks of an interest group. So this is where they put pressure on congressmen or members of the executive branch, but they try to influence them into making policy that the interest group supports. And when it comes to lobbying Congress, there are a number of ways that interest groups deal with this. Some of them we've already touched on. So for one, they testify at committee hearings. So when that legislation is going through the process and it's in the standing committee and they're thinking about it and they're debating it and they're revising it, they often will hold hearings in which they will listen to expert testimony, often from lobbyists, which will provide support or opposition to a particular bill. They can again engage in helping to be there as that legislation is being drafted, so helping to edit and revise that and giving influence on that sort of thing. So they can also offer support or threaten members of Congress if they're going to support them or not support them. So this could be through fundraising. Interest groups raise a lot of money, and they do this through something known as a political action committee. We're going to talk about that later in this unit, so we'll get that detail later. But for right now, the idea that interest groups raise a lot of money, it's an important one because they expect something for that money. So when they raise money for a candidate, they expect that that candidate will then listen to that interest group's lobbyist when they're there trying to persuade them, let's say, to pass legislation that that interest group supports. So they can threaten to take away their funding. They could threaten to give their funding to an opponent of that candidate, because really, again, what this interest group cares about is getting their legislation passed. So they're providing this information to the congressman. Now we might wonder, well, why are they going to accept it? Well, one reason is the campaign contributions, the money aspect of it. But another is an important fact that congressmen are policy generalists. They need to know a little bit about a large number of issues, whereas lobbyists are policy specialists. They are experts on that specific topic, and so they can do the research and have all this information, and they provide it to the congressman. And there's typically relationships where they know, all right, this is a more conservative interest group, so they're going to work more with conservative members of Congress. Or maybe a more liberal interest group will work with more liberal members of Congress. And so there's already that kind of understanding. And so when a liberal lobbyist comes to a liberal member of Congress with some kind of information, again, it's kind of saving the congressman a lot of time and effort, because they can take what that lobbyist provides them and they can use that to influence their decision about whether they're going to vote for or against a certain piece of legislation. The next thing to consider is that of iron triangles and issue networks. So if you remember back to Unit 2, we mentioned this before. An iron triangle is made up of congressional committees, members from bureaucratic agencies, as well as members of interest groups, really lobbyists. And what happens here is that there is a mutually beneficial transaction taking place here. This is where the interest group provides electoral support to members of Congress through fundraising, through that expert information, and in exchange, they get legislation passed that their interest group supports. Additionally, there is that bureaucratic agency involved here too. Remember that they're the ones who actually implement the legislation being passed by Congress. They also have the power to make administrative law. If you recall, they have rule-making authority, which means sometimes the interest group isn't as worried about the member of Congress as they are with the agency. So it could be the FDA or somebody like that. And the idea is that they want to make sure that legislation gets passed, whether it's by Congress or whether it's a regulation or administrative law. Either way, they want to make sure that it benefits their interest group. And so they support both of these members of this iron triangle, and in exchange, they get what they want. And one of the potential problems is an inequality of economic and political resources, meaning all interest groups aren't equally well off. Some have a lot of members, some have a lot of money, and those interest groups are naturally going to have more power and more influence. Right along with that is, as a result of that inequality, we will have unequal access to policymakers. So certain interest groups, certain lobbyists representing that group, maybe like the NRA for an example, that's a huge, powerful interest group. Maybe the AARP, another large, powerful interest group, they have direct access to congressmen. That congressperson knows, I need to pick up the phone when this lobbyist calls me because it's important. That person is largely responsible for my election, so they have much better access to policymakers than maybe people from smaller interest groups that have less influence and fewer resources. And lastly, there is something known as the free rider problem, and this is where it is difficult for the interest group to convince people to join. So if it's an interest group that is working on behalf of the public to try to get benefits for a large number of people, here's the problem. People who don't join the group can still benefit from the actions of the group. Therefore, the people have an incentive to free ride on the efforts of others who join that interest group, who pay the fees, who pay the dues, who do the hard work. And so when there are interest groups who do provide these public services, they sometimes have a lot of trouble with membership, which leads to trouble raising money, which again can lead to a decrease in their actual influence. Alright, so there's a lot of information in that video. Hope you stuck with me through the end. Well, you did because you're still watching this. So until next time, this has been a LaMoney production. Thanks again for watching this video. I'll see you guys next time.